I'm Bryony Vance, 38, and I am the lead neuro-oncologist who spent 15 years sacrificing my sleep, my sanity, and my youth to develop a non-invasive cure for glioblastoma. The air in the Grand Met ballroom smelled of expensive orchids and old money. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung precariously overhead, casting fractured rainbows across the sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns. I smoothed the fabric of my emerald silk dress for the 10th time in a minute. My palms were sweating so badly I was terrified to shake anyone's hand. This was the night of the Kepler Medical Awards. It was the night the world would finally see Protocol 7. It was the night I would change the face of cancer treatment forever. Beside me, my husband Julian stood like a statue carved from marble and arrogance. He adjusted his silk tie with a slow, deliberate movement that made my skin crawl. "Relax, darling," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad." His voice was smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of warmth. I forced a smile, but my lips felt like dry parchment. "I'm just nervous, Julian," I murmured, clutching my silver designer bag tighter. 15 years of work comes down to a 10-minute presentation. Julian chuckled, a low sound that vibrated through his chest but didn't reach his eyes. "Yes," he said, taking a sip of his champagne. "It certainly does." I looked at him, really looked at him. He was handsome in that sharp, predatory way that had drawn me in during med school. But tonight, his blue eyes were flat. They were dead sharks swimming in shallow water. A sudden wave of nausea rolled over me. It was just nerves, I told myself. It had to be nerves. The announcer's voice boomed over the speakers, reverberating through the floorboards and up through my heels. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The presentation for the Kepler Prize in Oncology will begin in 5 minutes." 5 minutes. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird desperate to break the cage. I needed to center myself. I needed to see the data one last time. It was a superstitious tic I had developed over the last decade. Before every board meeting, every grant proposal, every clinical trial review, I had to physically touch the flash drive containing the master key code. It was a sleek silver drive encrypted with biometric security. It held the algorithms that dissolved tumors without a single incision. I stepped slightly away from Julian, turning my back to the crowded room. I unclasped my clutch. My fingers dove into the velvet lining. I felt the cold metal of my lipstick tube. I felt the smooth glass of my phone screen. I felt the crinkle of a mint wrapper. I stopped. I dug deeper, my nails scraping against the bottom of the bag. Nothing. My breath hitched in my throat. I looked down, widening the opening of the clutch, ignoring the way my hands had started to tremble. It was empty. The velvet pocket where I had placed the drive 2 hours ago was flat. My blood turned to ice. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The chatter of the crowd warped into a deafening roar. I checked again, dumping the contents onto a small cocktail table beside me, not caring that my phone clattered loudly against the glass. Lipstick, mints, tissues, phone. "No drive." "No," I whispered, the words strangling me. "No, no, no." I patted my dress, pathetically searching for pockets I knew didn't exist. I checked the floor, thinking maybe I had dropped it. "Looking for something, Bryony?" The voice was calm, too calm. I spun around. Julian was watching me. He wasn't helping me search. He wasn't asking what was wrong. He was just standing there, swirling the golden liquid in his glass, a small, tight smirk playing on his lips. A horrific realization crashed into me with the force of a freight train. I hadn't lost it. I was careful. I was meticulous. I was the woman who double-checked the pH balance of a solution 5 times before administration. I did not lose things. Julian, I choked out, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. My drive, the presentation, it's gone. He took a slow sip of champagne. Is it? He asked. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded satisfied. My eyes dropped to his suit jacket, specifically to the inner breast pocket that was slightly weighed down. The outline was faint, rectangular, and small, but I knew that shape. I had held that shape in my hand every day for 3 years. The air left my lungs. You, I breathed. He stepped closer, closing the distance between us until he was invading my personal space. He reached into his jacket, but he didn't pull out the drive. He pulled out a thick, folded white envelope. You're right, Bryony, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was meant only for me to hear. You don't have the presentation. He shoved the envelope into my hand, his fingers bruising my wrist. You also don't have a husband anymore. I stared at the envelope, then I stared at him. What is this? I hissed, my shock rapidly curdling into a white-hot rage. Divorce papers, he said casually, as if he were discussing the weather. And a cease and desist order regarding Protocol 7. My brain short-circuited. Cease and desist, that's my research, my life's work. He corrected me, his eyes gleaming with malice. It was your work until you signed the transfer of intellectual property rights last month. I never signed anything, I snapped. You signed a lot of things when you were exhausted, darling, he sneered. House deeds, insurance updates, patent transfers disguised as tax forms. The room was spinning faster now. I remembered the night he brought me a stack of papers and a glass of wine. I remembered being so tired I could barely keep my eyes open after a 30-hour shift. I remembered trusting him. And since the patent is now held by Vance Halloway Enterprises, my newly formed LLC, you are technically trespassing on proprietary data. He checked his Rolex. I'm going to go up there now, he said, straightening his cuffs. I'm going to present my findings. I'm going to accept the Kepler Prize. And you are going to stand here and watch me become the man you never thought I could be. He leaned in close, his cologne suffocating me. You were always too busy saving the world to notice I was starving for a piece of it, Bryony, so I took it all. He turned on his heel and walked toward the stage. I stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom. My heart wasn't hammering anymore. It had stopped. I looked at the envelope in my hand. I looked at his retreating back. He thought he had won. He thought he had stripped me of everything. He thought I was just a scientist, a woman who played by the rules and lived in a lab. He forgot one thing. I was a neuro-oncologist. I spent my life cutting out malignant tumors that tried to kill their host. And as I watched Julian ascend the stairs to the stage, bathed in the spotlight that belonged to me, I realized something. He was just another cancer, and I was going to excise him. The ballroom plunged into darkness. It wasn't a gradual dimming. It was a sudden, suffocating blackness that felt like the lid of a coffin slamming shut. I stood rooted to the spot, the thick envelope of divorce papers crushing the bones of my fingers. My legs felt like they were filled with lead. My lungs refused to draw air. A single spotlight sliced through the dark, blinding white and terrifyingly precise. It landed on the stage. The keynote speaker, a man I had admired for decades, stepped into the light. He tapped the microphone. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice trembling with genuine excitement. We have a late addition to tonight's program. My heart stopped. It physically stopped beating in my chest. A breakthrough was submitted to the committee only 48 hours ago. The speaker continued. A breakthrough so significant, so revolutionary, that the board unanimously voted to suspend the rules to include it. I knew what he was going to say before he said it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run to the stage and tackle the microphone stand, but I was paralyzed. I was a spectator at my own funeral. Please welcome, the speaker boomed, sweeping his arm wide, Mr. Julian Vance. The applause was polite at first, confused. Then Julian stepped into the light. He walked with a predator's grace. He smoothed the front of his tuxedo jacket with one hand, the other raised in a humble wave that made bile rise in my throat. He looked golden. He looked heroic. He looked like a man who had nothing to hide. I watched him ascend the stairs. Every step he took felt like a heel grinding into my neck. He reached the podium and gripped the sides with confident hands. He didn't look for me in the crowd. He didn't need to. I was already a ghost to him. Thank you, Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, achieving that perfect, resonant pitch he practiced in the shower. I stand here tonight not just as a researcher, but as a husband who has watched the ravages of glioblastoma destroy families. Liar. The word screamed in my head. You don't care about families. You care about the patent valuation. For years I have worked in the shadows, he lied, his face the picture of solemn dedication. And tonight I am ready to bring the light. He clicked a small remote in his hand. The massive 40-foot screen behind him roared to life. The breath left my body in a sharp, agonizing wheeze. I expected him to have retyped my data. I expected him to have hired a graphic designer to polish my findings into slick corporate slides. He hadn't even done that. Projected on the screen, 40 feet tall and high definition, was a page from my lab notebook. My stomach violently lurched. I recognized the coffee stain in the corner. I recognized the jagged tear at the bottom of the page, where I had ripped it in frustration 3 years ago. And I recognized my handwriting. My loopy, frantic scrawl covered the screen. Subject 7 alpha shows regression, molecular bonds destabilizing at 4.5 hertz. I remembered writing those words. I remembered the night I wrote them. I was sitting on the cold tile floor of the lab at 4:00 a.m., weeping from exhaustion, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the pen. I had missed my niece's christening that weekend. I had missed my own birthday dinner. I had poured my soul onto that paper. And now Julian was standing in front of it, claiming it was his. He clicked the remote again. A complex molecular diagram appeared. It was the core structure of the delivery vector. I had drawn it by hand because the modeling software couldn't handle the complexity of the protein fold. As you can see here, Julian said, turning to point at my drawing, I developed a unique protein casing that bypasses the blood-brain barrier. He said I. The pronoun hit me like a physical slap. By utilizing a reverse transcriptase algorithm, he continued, using the exact phrasing I had whispered to him in bed 2 nights ago, we can target the malignant cells without harming the surrounding tissue. The audience gasped. A literal gasp rippled through the room. I saw the head of Johns Hopkins lean forward in his chair, his mouth slightly open. I saw the CEO of Pfizer scribbling furiously on a notepad. They were buying it. They were eating it up. They were witnessing a miracle, and they didn't care that the Messiah was a thief. Tears blurred my vision, hot, angry tears that burned my skin. He was stealing my past. He was stealing the 15 years of missed holidays, the failed relationships before him, the gray hairs, the stress ulcers. He was stealing the very essence of who I was. He clicked to the next slide. It was a video file. My knees buckled. I had to grab the back of a stranger's chair to keep from collapsing. It was the video of Mouse 44, the first subject to achieve full remission. I was the one holding the camera in that video. My voice was on the audio track. I waited for it. I waited to hear my own voice shouting in excitement as the scan cleared, but the audio was silent. He had muted me. He had literally silenced my voice so he could speak over it. The results speak for themselves, Julian said over the silent video of my triumph. Total eradication of the tumor mass in 14 days. Thunderous applause broke out before he even finished the sentence. People were standing up. Distinguished doctors were getting to their feet, clapping, cheering. Julian lowered his head modestly. He looked so humble, so grateful. I felt a wave of dizziness so potent I thought I might pass out. The room spun. The chandeliers smeared into streaks of jagged light. I looked down at the envelope in my hand. The cease and desist order. He had planned this perfectly. If I screamed now, I would look like a hysterical, jealous wife. If I ran to the stage, security would drag me away. He had the papers. He had the stage. He had the crowd. I looked up at him one last time. He was basking in the adoration, a golden god of medicine built on a foundation of my stolen blood. He caught my eye. Across the sea of tuxedos and diamonds, through the darkness and the flashing lights, he found me. He didn't look away. He winked. A small, barely perceptible wink. It was the final nail in the coffin of the woman I used to be. Bryony Vance, the loving wife, died in that moment. Bryony Vance, the exhausted researcher, died in that moment. The applause was deafening, a roar of approval for my own destruction. But beneath the noise, beneath the shock, beneath the crushing weight of the betrayal, something else began to tick. It was a cold, rhythmic pulse. It was the same focus that took over when I held a scalpel. It was the same icy detachment that allowed me to look at a terminal scan and find a way out. I stopped shaking. I stood up straight. I wiped the tears from my cheeks with a hand that was suddenly terrifyingly steady. Let him have the applause, I thought, watching him bow. Let him have the stage. Let him think he has won the war because he fired the first shot. He didn't understand the science he was presenting. He memorized the words, but he didn't know the music. He didn't know the flaw in the third trial. He didn't know about the side effect profile I had hidden in the encrypted sub-files he hadn't bothered to read. He had stolen the cure, but he had also stolen the poison. And he had no idea I was the only one with the antidote. I'm Bryony Vance, 34 years old, and until tonight, I was the invisible architect of the most significant cancer breakthrough of the 21st century. The house lights flooded the ballroom, harsh and unforgiving. The sudden brightness stung my eyes, but it was the noise that disoriented me. Hundreds of chairs scraped against the floor. Hundreds of voices rose in a cacophony of praise for the man who had just raped my mind on national television. Intermission, a voice announced over the PA system. Refreshments are served in the foyer. I didn't move toward the foyer. I didn't move toward the exits. I watched Julian disappear behind the heavy velvet curtains stage left. My body moved before my brain issued the command. I cut through the crowd like a scalpel through soft tissue. People bumped into me. Champagne sloshed onto the floor. "Excuse me," a donor in a red dress snapped as I brushed past her. I didn't hear her. My hearing had tunneled down to the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. It sounded like the ocean during a storm. I reached the side door guarded by a bored-looking security officer. I flashed my lanyard, the one that still said Dr. Bryony Vance, lead researcher, and he stepped aside without looking at my face. He didn't know who I was. Nobody did. The heavy metal door clicked shut behind me, cutting off the roar of the party. The silence here was sudden and violent. I was in the service corridor. The air was cold, smelling of concrete dust and industrial cleaning fluid. It was a dimly lit artery running behind the glamour of the stage, filled with coiled cables and discarded equipment cases. And there he was. Julian was standing near a stack of folded chairs, checking his reflection in the screen of his phone. He was adjusting his bow tie. He looked calm. He looked like a man who had just finished a round of golf, not a man who had just committed grand larceny. I stopped 10 feet away from him. My breath hitched in my throat, ragged and loud in the concrete tunnel. "Julian," I said. My voice sounded strange. It was brittle, trembling with a mixture of rage and sheer, unadulterated disbelief. He didn't jump, he didn't flinch. He slowly lowered his phone and slipped it into his pocket. He turned to face me with a look of mild inconvenience, as if I were a waitress who had brought him the wrong drink. "You're supposed to be in your seat, Bryony," he said. His voice was smooth, patronizing. "You stole it," I whispered, the words scraping my throat. "You stole everything, the vector, the protein casing, the mouse trials. That was my handwriting on the screen, Julian," he sighed. It was a long, weary exhalation. "It was our research, darling. We're a team, remember?" "I did the work," I screamed, the sound echoing off the bare walls. "I spent 4 years in that lab while you were out networking. You don't even know how the enzyme bonds work. You don't know the failure rate of the beta group." He took a step toward me. The shadows from the overhead caged lights cut across his face, making him look skeletal. "I know enough to sell it," he said softly, "and that's the only part that matters." "I'm going to the board," I said, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. "I'm going to the press. I'm going to tell them everything." He smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile a shark gives before it rolls its eyes back to bite. "I don't think you will." He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tuxedo. He pulled out a legal-sized envelope. It was thick, cream-colored, heavy. He closed the distance between us and slid the envelope into my numb hands. My fingers closed around it automatically. "What is this?" I asked. "Open it." I tore the seal. My hands were shaking so badly I ripped the top of the first page. I pulled out the stack of documents. The first word jumped out at me in bold, black font: "Petition for dissolution of marriage." The floor seemed to tilt beneath my heels. Divorce papers. He was serving me divorce papers in the back hallway of the medical awards gala. "Keep reading," he urged, his voice devoid of any emotion. I flipped the page. I saw a second document stapled to the back: Intellectual Property Assignment and Non-Compete Agreement. I scanned the legalese, my eyes burning. "All research, data, notes, and discoveries made during the cohabitation period are the sole and exclusive property of Vance Ventures. Signatory is barred from working in the field of neuro-oncology for a period of 5 years. Violation will result in immediate litigation." I looked up at him. I felt like I had been gutted. "You forged my signature," I choked out. I pointed to the bottom of the page. There it was, Bryony Vance. It looked perfect. It looked exactly like the signature I had used on our marriage license. "I didn't forge anything," Julian said, checking his watch again. "You signed that 3 months ago. Among the refinancing paperwork for the house. You really should read things before you sign them, doctor." My knees gave way. I stumbled back, catching myself against the rough concrete wall. He had planned this. He had been planning this for months. While I was sleeping in the lab monitoring cell cultures, he was with his lawyers. While I was crying over failed samples, he was liquidating our assets. "Why?" I whispered. I looked at the man I had shared a bed with for 7 years. I looked for a trace of the man who used to make me coffee in the morning. There was nothing there, just ambition wrapped in a tuxedo. "Why, Julian?" He stepped in close. He smelled of expensive cologne and ozone. He leaned down, bringing his lips close to my ear, intimate and cruel. "Because I finally outgrew you, Bryony," he whispered. His warm breath hit my skin, making me shiver. "You were useful for a while. You have a frantic little mind. But let's be honest." He pulled back to look me in the eye. His gaze was dead. You're exhausting. You're obsessed with the science, with the details, with the ethics. You are a distraction, and I can't afford distractions anymore." He reached out and patted my cheek, two gentle taps, like I was a dog he was putting outside for the night. "Enjoy the rest of the show," he said. He turned on his heel. He walked back toward the stage door, his shoes clicking rhythmically on the concrete. I stood there in the dim light. I held the papers that declared my life was over. I held the proof that my career was dead. I felt the rough paper cutting into the skin of my thumb. A tiny bead of blood welled up, a paper cut, such a small thing. But as I watched the drop of blood smear against the divorce decree, the shaking stopped. The tears evaporated. He called me a distraction. He thought he had buried me under a mountain of legal threats and public humiliation. He thought the non-compete would stop me. I looked at the paperwork again. He claimed ownership of everything I had done. Everything, including the data he didn't understand, including the fatal flaw in the protein casing that I had discovered 3 days ago, the flaw I hadn't had time to log in the official notes. He claimed the research, which meant he claimed the liability. A cold, dark laughter bubbled up in my chest. I folded the papers and slid them into my clutch. He wanted a distraction. I would give him a show he would never forget. I'm Dr. Bryony Vance, 34 years old, and I am currently the only person in this room who knows that the miracle cure being celebrated on stage is actually a biological time bomb. I slipped back into the ballroom just as the lights dimmed, the heavy velvet curtain swishing shut behind me to seal away the cold reality of the service corridor. My clutch felt heavier now. It wasn't just holding my lipstick and phone anymore. It was holding the divorce papers that legally severed me from my life's work. I navigated the darkened maze of tables, moving like a ghost. The air here was thick, perfumed with expensive lilies and the savory, metallic scent of roasted lamb. I found my seat at table 1, the table reserved for the honoree and his family. I sat down. My movements were mechanical. I placed my clutch on the white tablecloth right next to the crystal water glass. I smoothed the fabric of my emerald dress over my thighs, my fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from an overdose of adrenaline. Julian was already gone from the table. He was standing in the wings, waiting for his cue. The master of ceremonies, a balding man with a booming baritone voice, leaned into the microphone. "And now for the evening's highest honor," he bellowed, the sound reverberating in my chest cavity. "The Golden Asclepius Award goes to the visionary mind behind the neurocortex protocol, Dr. Julian Vance." The room exploded. 300 people rose to their feet in a wave of black tuxedos and glittering gowns. The applause was a physical force, a wall of sound that hit me in the face. I stayed seated. I forced my lips into a smile that felt like it was carved out of marble. Julian walked onto the stage. He bathed in the spotlight, the golden trophy gleaming in his hands like a stolen crown. He looked magnificent. He looked like a god. He waited for the applause to die down, timing it perfectly, milking the adoration for every second it was worth. "Thank you," he said, his voice dropping to a humble, intimate register that I knew he had practiced in our bathroom mirror. "Science is a lonely road," he continued, gripping the podium. "It requires long nights. It requires sacrifice. It requires a singular, unwavering focus that often alienates us from the ones we love." He paused. He looked down at the crowd. His eyes locked onto table 1. The spotlight swung around, blinding me, pinning me to my chair like a specimen on a slide. "But I was lucky," Julian said, his smile widening, benevolent and cruel. "I had an anchor. I want to thank my lovely wife, Bryony. The heads of every renowned oncologist and neurosurgeon in the room turned toward me. I felt their gazes crawling over my skin. Bryony, he went on, his voice dripping with condescension. Thank you for keeping our home standing while I was lost in the data. Thank you for the endless cups of coffee. Thank you for providing the emotional stability I so desperately needed to reach this pinnacle. He wasn't just taking credit, he was rewriting history. He was publicly designating me as the domestic support staff to his genius. He was erasing 4 years of my pipetting, my coding, my statistical analysis, and my sleepless nights in the lab, reducing them all to emotional stability. Stand up, darling, he urged. Let them see the woman behind the man. The applause started again, polite and encouraging. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stood up. My legs felt numb. I offered a small, shy wave to the room, playing the part he had written for me. The lovely wife, the support system, the distraction. I sat back down as quickly as I could, the darkness of the unlit table wrapping around me again. I looked up at him. He winked at me, a tiny, imperceptible twitch of his left eyelid. He thought he had won. He thought that by defining me as the wife, he had successfully undefined me as the scientist. But as I watched him clutch that golden statue, the heat rising in my blood began to change. The prickling sensation on the back of my neck cooled. The roaring in my ears faded into a sharp, crystalline silence. He had just told the entire world that this research was his alone. He had stood in front of the medical board, the press, and the investors and claimed sole authorship of the neurocortex protocol. He had claimed the glory, which meant he had also claimed the error. I looked at the champagne glass in front of me. Bubbles rose in a steady, chaotic stream, rushing to the surface to pop. Julian didn't know about the enzyme degradation I had found in the third phase trial data. He didn't know that the cure caused rapid neural hemorrhaging after 6 months of exposure. He didn't know because he was too busy filing divorce papers to read the latest pathology report. And now, thanks to this speech, no one would ever believe I had anything to do with it. He had insulated me perfectly. If I was just the wife who made the coffee, I couldn't be blamed when the lawsuit started. I couldn't be charged with negligence when the FDA audit began. He had stolen the credit, but he had unknowingly handcuffed himself to the catastrophe. I picked up my glass of champagne. I raised it toward the stage, a silent toast from the shadows. Enjoy it, Julian, I thought, taking a slow, cold sip. You wanted to be the sole genius. You just signed your own death warrant. I'm Dr. Bryony Vance, 34 years old, and I am currently the only person in this room who knows that the miracle cure being celebrated on stage is actually a biological time bomb. I couldn't watch another second of his victory lap. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the parquet floor, a sound swallowed entirely by the thunderous applause. I didn't look back at the stage. I didn't look at the colleagues who were whispering behind their hands, pitying the poor, devoted wife who was clearly overcome with emotion. I kept my head down and walked fast. I slipped through the double doors and into the corridor, the roar of the ballroom instantly cut off, replaced by the hushed, sterile hum of the hotel's air conditioning. My heels sank into the plush carpet as I navigated toward the ladies' lounge. I pushed the heavy door open. Empty. Thank God. The lounge was a sanctuary of cream marble and gold fixtures, smelling of expensive jasmine soap and silence. I walked to the sinks and gripped the cold porcelain edge until my knuckles turned white. I stared at the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked like a stranger. Her skin was too pale. Her lipstick was too red, like a fresh wound across her face. Her eyes were wide, dark, and terrified. I splashed cold water on my face, ruining the makeup I had spent an hour applying for him. I watched the water swirl down the drain, pink with dissolved foundation. My mind was racing, rewinding the last 6 months of my life. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent hunched over a microscope, my back aching, my eyes burning, while Julian was out securing funding at golf courses and steak dinners. I thought about the nights I slept on the lab floor. And then a memory clicked into place like a loaded magazine. Last month, the malware attack on our home server. I remembered the panic. I remembered Julian telling me not to worry, that he had his IT guys handling it, that it was just a random botnet from Russia. He had been so calm, too calm. He hadn't been fixing a breach. He had been creating one. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow to the gut. It wasn't a random attack. It was a data extraction. He had hacked his own wife to steal the Phase 3 trials before he served me with divorce papers. He needed the completed data to secure the award, and he needed me out of the picture to secure the patent rights. My lungs burned with every breath, the air in the room suddenly feeling too thin. I fumbled with my clutch, my fingers shaking as I pulled out the folded legal documents again. I needed to see it. I needed to see the lie in black and white. I scanned the schedule of assets attached to the divorce decree. There it was. Item 4A, Proprietary Research Data Neurocortex Protocol. He had listed the file directories he was claiming as his sole intellectual property. He was so arrogant. He was so sure that I was just the emotional support that he hadn't even bothered to scrub the evidence. I traced the list of file names with my thumb, my nail biting into the paper. Vance Protocol Core, exe Neural Map v4 DAT Synapse Bridge Library, DLL. He had taken everything, or so he thought. I stopped at the bottom of the list. I read it again. Then I read it a third time, and the panic in my chest began to transmute into something cold and sharp. A smile touched my lips. A jagged, dangerous thing. He had stolen the car, but he had left the keys. In his haste to copy the main architecture during the malware attack, he had missed the hidden dependency file. He had missed the ghost. I had named the subroutine Ghost Demon because it ran invisibly in the background, constantly recalibrating the enzyme dosage to prevent toxicity. It was a fail-safe I had coded 2 weeks ago to stop the neural hemorrhaging. I looked at the list again. Ghost Demon wasn't there. He didn't have it. He had stolen the raw, unstable version of the protocol. Without the ghost subroutine, the cure he was currently selling to the world wasn't just flawed. It was lethal. The neural map would destabilize within 48 hours of injection. He had just announced a product that would turn patients' brains into soup, and he had claimed sole, exclusive ownership of it in a court of law. He hadn't just stolen my work. He had stolen a murder weapon and put his fingerprints all over it. I looked back at my reflection. The terrified stranger was gone. The woman in the mirror was smiling, and her eyes were hard as diamonds. He wanted to be the genius. He wanted to take credit for every single line of code. I folded the papers and snapped my clutch shut. "Okay, Julian," I whispered to the empty room. "You can have it. I'm Dr. Bryony Vance, 34 years old, and I am holding the digital detonator to a medical scandal that will obliterate my husband's career." I leaned back against the cold marble sink, the silence of the ladies' lounge humming in my ears like static. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of absolute, terrifying clarity. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. The screen lit up my face in a harsh, artificial blue glow. I needed to be sure. I needed to see the exact timestamps. I logged into my private encrypted server, bypassing the biometric locks with a swipe of my thumb. The interface loaded, a cascading waterfall of file directories and version histories. I navigated to the folder labeled Neurocortex Phase 3. There it was. The access log showed a massive data transfer at 3:14 a.m. last Tuesday. That was the night of the malware attack. That was the night Julian had been pacing in his study, pretending to be on the phone with tech support while he was actually draining my life's work onto an external drive. I tapped on the file he had stolen, version 4.2 beta. My breath hitched in my throat. He had taken version 4.2. He hadn't taken version 4.3. I opened the data visualizer, my eyes scanning the complex protein folding sequences Julian was currently bragging about on the main stage just a few walls away. The 3D model spun on my small screen, a beautiful, intricate lattice of amino acids and synthetic enzymes. To the naked eye, to the investors, to the FDA board, it looked flawless. It looked like the future of medicine, but I knew where to look. I zoomed in on the metabolic delivery system, the chemical vehicle designed to transport the drug across the blood-brain barrier. My heart stopped, then restarted with a violent thud against my ribs. I traced the bonding affinity of the carrier molecule in version 4.2. It was too high, way too high. In a Petri dish, this calculation error was invisible. In a computer simulation, it looked like robust efficiency. But in a living, breathing human subject, that hyper-affinity wouldn't just deliver the drug. It would flood the receptors. I closed my eyes, running the biological simulation in my mind, a horror movie playing out in cellular detail. Once injected, the delivery system would bind irreversibly to the patient's immune signaling proteins. The body wouldn't recognize it as a cure. It would recognize it as a massive, systemic invasion. It would trigger a catastrophic cytokine storm within 48 hours. I opened my eyes and stared at the phone, my stomach churning with a sudden wave of nausea. The patients wouldn't just get sick. Their immune systems would go nuclear, attacking their own organs in a scorched earth attempt to purge the foreign agent. Fevers spiking to 107 degrees. Lungs filling with fluid. Multiple organ failure before the doctors could even diagnose the cause. Julian hadn't just stolen my work. He had stolen a death sentence and called it a miracle. He was out there right now, accepting a prestigious award for a weapon of mass destruction. A dark, hysterical laugh bubbled up in my chest, and I had to bite my lip to suppress it. He was so desperate to cut me out, so eager to claim he did it all himself, that he didn't realize he was holding a live grenade with the pin pulled. I looked at the timestamp again. If he had waited just 24 hours, if he had treated me with even an ounce of respect instead of plotting my disposal, he would have stolen the patch. He would have stolen the version where I fixed the delivery ratio. But his greed had made him sloppy. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my clutch, the metal clasp clicking shut with a sound like a guillotine blade dropping. Let him have the applause. Let him have the statue. Let him sign the distribution deals. Every signature he put on paper was another nail in his coffin. I smoothed the silk of my dress, checked my reflection one last time, and walked toward the door. I was going back out there. I was going to sit in that chair, drink his champagne, and smile at him. I would watch him bask in the glory of his own destruction. I'm Dr. Bryony Vance, 34 years old, and I am walking back into a ballroom to burn my husband's life to the ground with a single whisper. I pushed the heavy mahogany door of the ladies' lounge open. The sound of the gala hit me like a physical wall. It was a roar of polite applause, the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, and the low hum of expensive conversation. 10 minutes ago, this noise had made me feel small. It had made me feel like an accessory, a trophy wife in a silk dress meant to stand silently beside the great genius. Now, it sounded different. It sounded like a room full of people waiting for a punchline they didn't know was coming. I stepped onto the plush carpet of the main hall. The air smelled of roasted duck, heavy perfume, and old money. I took a deep breath, letting the scent fill my lungs, grounding me. My heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. It wasn't the frantic flutter of the heartbroken woman who had run into the bathroom to cry. It was the heavy, deliberate thud of a predator entering the tall grass. I scanned the room. Far away on the illuminated stage, Julian was still speaking. He was gripping the podium, his knuckles white, his smile charming and practiced. He was pointing to a projected slide of my molecular lattice, explaining the binding affinity with a confidence that made my stomach turn. He looked so powerful up there. He looked untouchable. I adjusted the strap of my clutch, feeling the weight of the phone inside. I didn't look at him. He wasn't my target anymore. He was just the distraction. I turned my gaze to the front table, the VIP section reserved for the board of directors and the biggest donors. I found him immediately. Dr. Eris Thorne. He was the chairman of the Medical Ethics Board and the man whose signature was on the $20 million grant that kept Julian's lab lights on. He was sitting with his back to me, his silver hair gleaming under the chandelier light. He was nodding along to Julian's speech, swirling a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked relaxed. He looked rich. He had no idea that he was currently funding a biological catastrophe. I began to walk toward him. The path was crowded. A woman in a sequined blue dress reached out and touched my arm as I passed. "Bryony, darling," she gushed, her voice shrill. "You must be so proud. Julian is absolutely brilliant tonight." I stopped. I turned my head slowly and looked her in the eye. I forced the corners of my mouth up into a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "He certainly is full of surprises," I said. My voice was steady, smooth, and cold as ice. I didn't wait for her to respond. I kept moving. I wove through the tables, my eyes fixed on the back of Eris's head. Every step felt heavy with purpose. I was the architect of this moment. I was the only person in this room who understood the language of the code Julian was projecting on the screen. I reached the VIP table. I didn't sit down. I didn't wave. I simply glided up behind Eris's chair. He must have sensed my presence, or maybe he smelled my perfume because he started to turn his head. I didn't give him the chance to speak. I placed one hand gently on his shoulder. The fabric of his tuxedo was expensive, smooth wool. I felt the muscle beneath it tense slightly at my touch. I leaned down. I brought my lips inches from his ear, invading his personal space just enough to signal dominance. On stage, Julian was building to his crescendo. "This protocol represents the dawn of a new era," Julian shouted into the microphone, his voice booming through the speakers. Under the cover of my husband's applause, I dropped the bomb. "Eris," I whispered. My voice was low, intimate, and laced with venom. "You need to look at the metabolic delivery rate on slide 4. Eris froze. His hand stopped swirling his drink. He didn't turn around yet. He was listening. "Julian is using the Beta 4.2 architecture," I continued, speaking clearly, enunciating every syllable. "He forgot to factor in the enzyme decay." I felt a tremor go through Eris's shoulder. He was a businessman, but he was a doctor first. He knew what enzyme decay meant in a neurological drug. It meant toxicity. It meant death. "That's impossible," Eris hissed back, keeping his voice low, his eyes still fixed on the stage where Julian was bowing. The trials were flawless. I leaned in closer. My hair brushed against his cheek. The trials were faked, Eris, I whispered. He stole the wrong file from my server. Without the ghost subroutine I wrote, that drug is going to liquefy the frontal cortex of your first human subject within 48 hours. Eris turned his head then. He whipped around so fast his wine splashed against the side of the glass. He looked up at me. His face, usually flushed with the confidence of wealth, was suddenly ash gray. His eyes searched mine, looking for a lie, looking for hysteria. He didn't find any. He found a woman who was perfectly calm. He found a scientist who knew exactly what she was talking about. "You're funding a mass murder event," I said, my voice barely a breath. "And when the FDA autopsies those patients, they aren't going to look at Julian. They're going to look at the man who signed off on the safety protocols. They're going to look at you." The color drained completely from his lips. He looked from me to the stage. Julian was beaming, holding the crystal award high above his head as the room gave him a standing ovation. The clapping sounded like thunder. To Eris, it must have sounded like the gavel of a judge sentencing him to prison. He looked back at me, his eyes wide with genuine terror. "Do you have proof?" he choked out. I smiled. It was a sharp, dangerous smile. I slowly lifted my clutch. I tapped a manicured fingernail against the hard shell. "I have the original source code," I said. "I have the time-stamped logs showing the theft, and I have the corrected simulation that shows exactly how the patients die." I paused, letting the threat hang in the air between us. "I can send it to the FDA right now," I whispered. "Or I can send it to you." Eris swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed in his throat. He understood the transaction instantly. He could go down with Julian's sinking ship, or he could take the lifeboat I was offering. He slowly set his glass down on the table. His hand was shaking. "Show me," he whispered. I straightened up, smoothing the front of my dress. I looked down at him with pity. "Check your inbox in 5 minutes, Eris." I turned on my heel. I didn't look back at the stage. I didn't look at my husband, who was currently basking in the adoration of a crowd he had lied to. I walked toward the side exit, the air rushing into my lungs, cold and sweet. I had just pulled the pin. Now I just had to wait for the explosion. I'm Dr. Bryony Vance, 34 years old, and I am about to commit professional homicide on a live feed. I didn't leave the ballroom. I moved to the shadows at the back of the room near the technical booth. I watched Eris pull out his phone, his face pale as he checked his email. I saw the moment the file hit his inbox. I saw his shoulders slump as he realized the magnitude of the lie he had just applauded. But Eris was just the insurance policy. Julian was the target. The applause finally died down, fading into a respectful silence. The moderator, a perky woman in a red blazer, stepped up to the side of the stage. "What an incredible breakthrough," she chirped. Julian beamed, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead with a silk handkerchief. He looked like a king surveying his kingdom. "We have time for a brief Q&A, the moderator announced, shielding her eyes against the stage lights to scan the audience. "Are there any questions for Dr. Blackwood regarding the new protocol?" A few hands shot up in the front rows. Sycophants. Journalists looking for a soundbite. I didn't raise my hand. I simply stepped out of the shadows. I walked straight down the center aisle. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor where the carpet ended, a sharp, rhythmic sound that cut through the murmurs. The spotlight operator, thinking I was part of the show, swung the beam toward me. The light hit me like a physical blow, blinding and hot. I didn't flinch. I kept walking, my eyes locked on Julian's face. The room went deadly silent. Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features before he plastered the charm back on. He thought I was coming to congratulate him. He thought I was the doting wife coming to stand by his side for the photo op. He leaned into the microphone. "Ah," he said, his voice oozing false affection. "It seems my better half wants to join me. Everyone, please welcome my wife, Bryony." There was a scattering of polite applause. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I stopped 10 feet from the stage, right in the center of the aisle. A confused sound technician hurried over and thrust a handheld microphone into my hand. I gripped the cold metal. My palms were dry. My pulse was a steady drum in my ears. "I don't want to join you, Julian," I said. My voice rang out through the ballroom, amplified and crystal clear. The polite applause died instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with sudden tension. Julian chuckled, a nervous, jagged sound. "I think the excitement has been a bit much for everyone," he said, trying to wave me off. "Perhaps we can." "I have a technical question regarding the presentation," I interrupted. I saw his jaw tight. He gripped the podium harder. "Go ahead," he said, his tone sharpening. "But let's keep it brief, darling. We have a schedule." I took a step closer. I needed to see his eyes when the knife went in. "Can you explain the third-tier protein synthesis sequence on slide 12? I asked. The question hung in the air. To the donors and the board members, it sounded like gibberish. To a geneticist, it was a basic foundational query. To Julian, it was a death sentence. He blinked. He looked back at the screen behind him, where the slide was no longer visible. He looked back at me. The synthesis," he stammered. "Yes," I said, my voice relentless. "Specifically the binding agent you used to stabilize the lattice. In your speech, you claimed the stability was 99%. But looking at the molecular geometry you projected, the third-tier sequence lacks a covalent bond." I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. "How did you overcome the atomic repulsion without that bond, Julian?" He opened his mouth. He closed it. His face began to turn a blotchy, ugly red. He didn't know the answer. He didn't know because he hadn't written the code. I had, and I had intentionally left that specific explanation out of the files on the server he raided. It's a proprietary trade secret," he sputtered, trying to pivot. "Too complex to explain in this setting." "It's not complex," I shot back. "It's biochemistry. Either the bond exists or the molecule collapses." The crowd was murmuring now. They could smell the blood in the water. Julian laughed again, but it sounded like a choke. "Bryony, really, this isn't the place for a domestic debate on?" "It's not a debate," I said. I tucked the microphone under my arm and reached into my clutch. I pulled out my tablet. I had been the lead system administrator for our lab for 5 years. I knew the venue's presentation software. I knew the guest override code because I was the one who set up Julian's laptop this morning before he served me the divorce papers. He had forgotten that. He had forgotten that while he was busy stealing my future, I was still the one holding the keys to his digital life. I tapped the screen. "Syncing," I whispered to myself. The massive LED screen behind Julian flickered. His polished blue and white presentation vanished. The audience gasped. Julian spun around, his eyes wide with panic. "What is this?" he shouted, his voice cracking. Technical support cut the feed. But it was too late. A new image filled the 20-foot screen. It was a split-screen overlay. On the left was Julian's presentation from tonight, stamped with today's date. On the right were my personal lab logs. The timestamps on my logs were from 3 years ago. I brought the microphone back to my lips. "You can't explain the synthesis, Julian, because you didn't invent it," I said. I tapped my tablet again. The screen zoomed in on a specific block of code. My handwriting was digitized in the margins of the log, clear as day. "These are my notes," I narrated, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Dated October 14th, 3 years ago. Note the error in the third tier sequence. The same error you just presented as a breakthrough." Julian looked small against the backdrop of the giant screen. He looked like a child caught wearing his father's suit. "She's lying," he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She's jealous. She's trying to sabotage the company." I ignored him. I looked at the audience. I looked directly at the camera streaming the event to the web. "He didn't just steal my work," I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming deadly serious. "He stole an obsolete, dangerous version of it." I swiped on the tablet. A simulation loaded on the big screen. It was a 3D render of a human brain reacting to the drug. Red warning lights flashed on the simulation. "Critical failure. Tissue necrosis imminent. The version of the drug Julian just sold you has a 100% fatality rate in primate models," I stated. The room erupted. Chairs scraped against the floor as people stood up. Voices rose in a cacophony of shock and outrage. Julian was paralyzed. He stood center stage, bathed in the light of his own incompetence, the red warning of the simulation reflecting off his sweating face. He looked at me with pure hatred. I looked back with absolutely nothing. I wasn't his wife anymore. I wasn't his victim. I was the scientist who just corrected a data error. I lowered the microphone. I disconnected my tablet, leaving the damning evidence frozen on the screen behind him. I turned my back on the stage. I started walking toward the exit. I didn't run. I didn't look down. Behind me, I heard the heavy footsteps of security, but they weren't coming for me. I heard Eris shouting orders. I heard Julian screaming my name, his voice breaking into a sob. I pushed through the double doors and stepped out into the cool night air of the valet stand. My hands were finally shaking. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with oxygen that didn't smell like expensive lies. The valet looked at me, surprised to see someone leaving so early. "Leaving already, ma'am?" he asked. I handed him my ticket. "Yes," I said, a small, genuine smile touching my lips for the first time in days. "The show is over. I'm Dr. Serafina Vance, 32, and tonight I didn't just divorce my husband. I systematically dismantled his entire existence in front of the people he worshipped." I hadn't even made it to the curb before the ballroom doors flew open behind me. "Dr. Vance, Serafina, wait." It was Eris, the CEO of the biotech firm, and he wasn't asking, he was begging. His face was gray, stripped of all its usual corporate arrogance. "The board," he panted, catching up to me as the valet held my door open. "They're freezing the assets. They need verification. If you leave now, the stock tanks to zero by morning. Please." I paused, my hand hovering over the car door handle. I could have left. I could have let the company burn to the ground along with Julian. But that would have been mercy, and I was fresh out of mercy. "I'm not doing this for the stock price, Eris," I said, my voice cold enough to freeze the humid night air. "I know," he nodded frantically. "Just finish it properly." I turned on my heel. Walking back into that ballroom felt like walking into a gladiator arena after the lions had been starved. The murmurs stopped the second I crossed the threshold. Julian was still on stage, but he wasn't the king anymore. He was surrounded by 3 board members who looked ready to execute him. When he saw me return, a flicker of desperate hope lit up his eyes. He thought I was coming back to recant. He thought I was going to say it was all a bitter domestic misunderstanding. He grabbed the microphone, his knuckles white. "See," he stammered, his voice cracking over the speakers. "She's back. She knows she went too far. Tell them, Serafina. Tell them you're just emotional about the separation." I didn't take the stairs. I walked to the tech booth at the side of the stage. I plugged my tablet directly into the main feed, overriding the lockdown the IT team was frantically trying to establish. "I'm not emotional, Julian," I said, my voice booming through the hall without a microphone, projected purely by the rage sitting in my chest. "I'm precise." I tapped the screen. The giant LED display behind him shifted from the necrosis simulation to a wall of raw data. "This is the metadata from the source files," I announced, my eyes scanning the terrified faces of the donors. I highlighted a column of text. "File creation date, August 14th. Creation location, the Vance private server located in my home laboratory." I swiped left. "Julian's location on August 14th, I continued, pulling up his own Instagram geotags and flight logs. "The St. Regis Resort, Bora Bora." The silence in the room was deafening. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that settled over everyone. The board of directors stared at the screen. They looked from the timestamp to Julian, doing the mental math that ended his career. "You can't code a complex protein sequence from a swim-up bar, Julian," I said softly. "She hacked it," Julian screamed, spit flying from his lips. "She planted it. This is corporate espionage." "You're right about the espionage," I replied. I looked down at my tablet. My finger hovered over the play icon. "5 minutes ago in the hallway you served me divorce papers," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "You thought you had won, you got sloppy." I pressed the button. The audio quality was pristine. My voice came through the speakers first, sounding small and hurt. "You're stealing my life's work, Julian." Then his voice, arrogant and sneering, echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "Nobody cares who writes the code, Serafina. They care who sells it. You're just the mechanic, I'm the driver, and now that I have the keys, I don't need you in the car." The gasp from the audience was audible, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the room. Julian's face went slack. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. He looked at the donors, the people whose validation he craved more than air, and saw only disgust. He looked at the board members and saw litigation. Then he looked at me, and he saw the end. Something in him snapped. A feral, animalistic noise tore from his throat. "You bitch," he roared. He launched himself off the podium. He didn't run, he flew, vaulting over the monitors, his eyes wide and bloodshot, hands clawing for the tablet in my grasp. My heart hammered against my ribs, a painful, frantic rhythm. I didn't move, I didn't flinch, I watched him come. 2 steps before he reached me, a blur of motion intercepted him. The venue's security, massive and unamused, slammed into Julian like a freight train. The impact was sickeningly loud. Julian hit the floor hard, the wind knocked out of him with a wheeze that was amplified by the microphone he had dropped. He scrambled, trying to crawl toward me, trying to grab my ankles, but a knee was pressed into his back. "Stay down," the guard barked. I looked down at him. His tuxedo was twisted, his hair wild, his face pressed against the carpet. Sirens began to wail in the distance, getting louder by the second. Eris stepped up to the microphone, his voice shaking. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "please remain calm. The police are en route." He looked down at Julian. Effective immediately, Julian Blackwood is stripped of the title Innovator of the Year and terminated from his position pending a criminal investigation for fraud and grand larceny. Julian began to sob. It wasn't a sad sound. It was the pathetic, grating sound of a narcissist realizing the mirror was broken. I unplugged my tablet. My hands were finally steady. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, hollow exhaustion. I walked over to where he lay pinned to the floor. I crouched down just inches from his ear. The smell of his expensive cologne was now mixed with the metallic scent of fear. You were right about one thing, Julian, I whispered, loud enough only for him to hear. He stopped struggling and looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. What? He choked out. You were the driver, I said, standing up and smoothing my dress. But you forgot that I built the engine, and I know exactly how to shut it off. I turned my back on him. The police burst through the double doors, blue lights reflecting off the crystal chandeliers. I walked toward them, ready to give my statement. I was Dr. Serafina Vance, and I was just getting started. I'm Dr. Serafina Vance, 32, and tonight I reclaimed my name, my science, and my freedom in a single devastating heartbeat. I watched the red and blue lights dance across the crystal chandeliers of the ballroom. The strobe effect made the stunned socialites look like statues trapped in a horror movie. I didn't look away as the officers shoved Julian through the double doors. He was limp, his feet dragging against the plush carpet, his sobbing audible even over the chaos. I felt a strange, vibrating emptiness in my chest. It wasn't sadness. It was the sudden, violent absence of a burden I had been carrying for 5 years. The room was suspended in a thick, suffocating silence. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on me. They looked terrified, they should be. I had just turned their golden boy into a felon in under 10 minutes. Eris, the CEO, stood alone on the stage. He looked small. He looked like a man watching his stock options evaporate into mist. He looked at the empty podium where Julian had stood, then at the heavy golden trophy that had been abandoned on a side table. The Innovator of the Year award. It was shaped like a double helix rising from a block of obsidian. Eris picked it up. His hands were trembling so badly the metal rattled against his wedding ring. He looked at the crowd, then he looked at me. He cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the dead air. The work, Eris stammered, his voice climbing an octave. The algorithm, the cure, it exists. He pointed a shaking finger at me. It belongs to her. The crowd shifted. It started as a ripple. One person stood up, then another. It wasn't the polite, rhythmic clapping of a gala. It was a thunderous, urgent wave of noise. They were cheering for me, but I knew the truth. They weren't cheering because they respected me. They were cheering because I held the keys to the kingdom and they wanted to be on the winning side of history. Eris gestured for me to come up. I didn't rush. I smoothed the silk of my dress. I adjusted the strap of my clutch. I walked down the center aisle, the sound of my heels striking the floor hidden beneath the roar of applause. I felt like I was walking through water. Every face I passed was a blur of fear and admiration. I climbed the stairs to the stage. The lights were blindingly hot. I could smell the lingering scent of Julian's sweat and fear in the air. Eris practically shoved the trophy into my hands. "Fix this, Serafina," he hissed, leaning in close, his smile plastered on for the cameras. "Save the company and you can name your price." I looked at him. I didn't smile back. "My price," I said, my voice magnified by the podium mic, "is the truth." I took the trophy. It was heavy. It felt cold and solid, a physical manifestation of the sleepless nights, the skipped meals, and the stolen years. I set it down on the podium with a heavy thud. The noise silenced the room again. I reached into my clutch. My fingers brushed against the crisp, folded paper, the divorce decree. Julian had served it to me in the hallway 40 minutes ago, thinking it was his victory lap. He thought he was discarding me. I pulled the document out. I unfolded it slowly, deliberately. The cameras zoomed in. My face was projected on the massive screens behind me, 10 feet tall, impassive and sharp as cut glass. I smoothed the paper out on the podium right next to the trophy. I needed a pen. I looked down. There, abandoned near the microphone, was Julian's fountain pen. It was a Mont Blanc black resin with gold trim. I knew exactly how much it cost because I was the one who paid the credit card bill it was charged to. I picked it up. It felt warm. I uncapped it. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I leaned over the microphone. Julian wanted a divorce, I said, my voice steady, echoing through the cavernous hall. He wanted to separate his assets from mine. I looked directly into the camera lens, knowing he would see this footage in a holding cell or a lawyer's office. I am granting his wish. I pressed the nib to the paper. The ink flowed black and permanent. Serafina Vance. I signed it with a flourish that felt like severing a limb and growing wings at the same time. I capped the pen. I left the papers there, signed and waiting under the glare of the spotlight. I left the pen on top of them. I picked up my trophy. I didn't say thank you. I didn't wave. I didn't acknowledge the board of directors who were now huddled together like frightened sheep. I turned and walked toward the stairs. The applause started again, wilder this time, desperate. They wanted a speech. They wanted reassurance. They wanted me to tell them that everything was going to be okay, that the stock wouldn't tank, that the miracle drug was ready for market. I gave them nothing. I descended the stairs, the gold trophy tucked under my arm like a weapon. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. Men in $5,000 tuxedos stepped back to give me space. Women who had ignored me during the cocktail hour watched me with wide, hungry eyes. I kept my chin up. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my face was stone. I pushed through the double doors at the back of the room. The noise of the gala cut off instantly, replaced by the muffled quiet of the hotel corridor. I kept walking. I walked past the shocked catering staff. I walked past the security guards who nodded at me with newfound respect. I walked out the front entrance of the hotel. The night air hit me like a physical blow. It was cool and smelled of rain and exhaust. It was the sweetest thing I had ever smelled. My car was waiting. The valet scrambled to open the door, his eyes darting to the massive trophy in my hand. "Good night, Dr. Vance," he stammered. I paused. I looked back at the hotel. The lights were blazing. Inside, they were scrambling to rewrite the narrative. Inside, Eris was probably already on the phone with legal. Inside, Julian's life was nothing but ash and ruins. I looked down at the trophy. It wasn't just metal, it was proof. I placed the award on the passenger seat. I gripped the steering wheel. My hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb, leaving me trembling and raw. But I wasn't breaking. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. My lipstick was perfect. My eyes were clear. I wasn't a wife anymore. I wasn't a victim. I wasn't a silent partner. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, a deep, powerful growl that vibrated through the chassis. I shifted into gear. I pulled away from the curb, leaving the Gala, the lies, and Julian Blackwood in the dust. I drove into the dark, open road. I had a lab to get to. I had work to do. And for the first time in my life, every single discovery would belong to me.